Hello, and welcome everyone to this companion series to A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide, An Introduction to Pali. Today we come to Lesson 22, which is quite a short chapter, looking at consonantal stems in an, the pronoun attan, and we revisit Bahubbīhi compounds. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. We begin Lesson 22 by returning to consonantal stems in an, specifically looking at the declension of attan, self, and Brahman, loosely translated here as God. These are both masculine nouns, and the plural forms of atta in the oblique cases are rarely, if ever, found. So we can see that they are very similar in their declension, except in the vocative where Brahme has the Eastern dialect a ending. And if we take another example, Carmen is a neuter noun in the stem an. It largely inflects like the masculine nouns, for instance Brahman, except in the nominative and accusative. And as well as these forms, Carmen can decline like a normal a-stem neuter noun as well. At this point it might be good to add that I have been simplifying the declension process somewhat. The generalized tables that I've presented are designed purely to assist recognition, and aren't a precise description of the declension process. For instance, by now you should be familiar with the idea that verb stems can have different strengths. Well, noun stems too can also have different strengths, and this is particularly apparent with the stems ending an, as we can see here with Carmen and Rajan. So, knowing this alters what we might define as the inflectional ending. However, Warder doesn't mention this at all, and so I just want to mention it here in passing as something to be aware of. Okay. Let's return now to look at attan in more detail. As well as being a noun meaning the self, attan is often used as a pronoun reflexively, meaning oneself. Reflexive pronouns in English are words like myself, yourself, himself, itself, etc., and they are object pronouns that refer back to the subject. So they are used when the subject and the object of the sentence refer to the same person or thing. She sees herself. Now, there's a whole separate tutorial on reflexive pronouns, so I'll refer you to that and just summarise here. In actual fact, there are no reflexive pronouns in Pali. However, attan, as mentioned, is often used in the masculine singular in a reflective sense, to represent all genders and numbers of people. And there's also a more archaic version, attuman. In the genitive, these act like a pronominal adjective, meaning one's own. Pali is careful to distinguish between a third-person possessive pronoun, when the meaning is someone else's, and the reflexive, when the meaning is one's own. So this is literally, he saw the village of himself. And in the instrumental, it means by oneself, or personally. So, in this example, this essentially means, on no one else's account are bad deeds done. The possessive sense of atta is very similar to the reflexive adjective saka. This word is an adjective and, unlike atta, inflects in all three genders. Its primary meaning is one's own, and it's important to note that saka agrees with the thing possessed and not the possessor. Other reflexive expressions include the indeclinables sa mang and sayang. Both of these mean by or from oneself. And another way of expressing possession is to use the prefix sa, literally own, compounded with the object possessed. For example, sat sitang, one's own mind. Finally, Warder returns to Bahubbīhi compounds for a third time. Back in lesson 19, I said that a Bahubbīhi was a compound used like an adjective to qualify another word. And this is how many, including Warder, define them. However, others are more precise. If we briefly recap some types of compounds, with the tapurissa, there is a case relationship between the two members, and the individual member stems may be either substantives or adjectives. With the Kamadaria, the two elements describe the same thing, and can be a combination of substantives, adjectives, and even an adverb. And as we've seen, both of these types of compound can be used to qualify another noun external to the compound itself. Now, if we're being precise, for a compound to be classed as a Bahubbīhi, the final member of the compound should be a substantive, and they should also yield to the relative clause formula, which is along the lines of a C whose B is A. And this means, technically, not all Kamadaria compounds used adjectively are Bahubbīhis, as the final member of many are not a substantive. And gender can help establish whether a compound is an adjectival Kamadaria or a Bahubbīhi. For instance, rupang anatta. Atta here is masculine, and rupang is neuter. A Bahubbīhi compound would require atta to agree with rupang, so we know that this statement is a Kamadaria, used here as a complement, and means form is not self rather than form has no self. To avoid this need for gender change, sometimes the suffix ka or ika is added to the final member of a Bahubbīhi, which makes the word specifically an adjective. And these then decline like an A-stem adjective to agree with the noun qualified. For instance, families whose women are many. And some prefix words, for instance those which begin with su or du, are sometimes classed as Bahubbīhis too. Note here that many of the examples which Warder gives are not technically Bahubbīhis. For instance, we can tell this is not a Bahubbīhi because its final member is not a noun, and it cannot be glossed by a relative construction. A deed whose done is well makes no sense. So this is a Kamadaria used adjectively. And I should point out here that I myself am no expert on this. Negative prefixes can similarly be added, as we've seen before, and the first member of a Bahubbīhi can also be indeclinable. For example, a man whose virtue is thus. And Warder lists some other types of prefix, which now should be self-evident to you. Well, I think I'll end lesson 22 here. Again, Warder provides a short dictionary worth of vocabulary, followed by a passage for translation, and there are links to solutions in the description below. Next week we examine agent nouns, and I'll give a brief overview of sandhi, or the joining of sounds. And of course, until then, there's always my other tutorials and my blog.